The chamber was quiet, but it wasn't calm. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, the kind that holds its breath before truth is spoken, and in that moment, the air felt heavy with expectation, with tension, with the weight of history pressing against the walls of the hearing room like an invisible tide. The historian sat at the center, his posture composed, his eyes steady, not with defiance, but with a kind of quiet resolve that comes only from decades of study, of reflection, of bearing witness to the rise and fall of narratives that shape nations. And across from him sat Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, her reputation preceding her like a shadow, sharp, unfiltered, unapologetic, a figure both revered and reviled depending on which side of the aisle one stood. She leaned forward, her voice slicing through the stillness like a blade. "Your books only tell one side of the story," she said. "You're rewriting history to fit your politics." And the words hung in the air, like smoke, provocative, accusatory, designed not to question but to corner, and yet the historian didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't retreat into defensiveness or outrage. Instead, he looked at her, not with contempt but with a kind of measured curiosity, as if weighing the weight of her words against the centuries he had studied, the lives he had chronicled, the truths he had unearthed from beneath layers of myth and denial. And then he spoke, slowly, deliberately. "Congresswoman, history isn't a weapon, it's a mirror. You can shatter the glass, but you can't escape your reflection." And the room shifted, subtly, as if the very architecture had leaned in to listen, and Greene narrowed her eyes, her tone sharpening. "So you're saying I'm afraid of the truth?" To which the historian replied, "I'm saying that truth doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs courage to be spoken." And with that, the tension escalated. Cameras zoomed, pens scribbled, and the hearing was no longer procedural. It was personal, ideological, existential. Greene raised her voice. "You're manipulating facts, teaching our children to hate their country." And the historian paused, not because he was unsure, but because he understood the gravity of what needed to be said next. And then, with a voice that carried the weight of generations, he said, "I teach them to understand it, because love without understanding is blind. And blind patriotism is not loyalty, it's obedience." And again, silence fell. But this time it was a silence of reckoning, of reflection, of discomfort, and Greene leaned back, momentarily disarmed, while others in the room exchanged glances, some nodding, some frowning, some simply stunned. The historian continued, "When we sanitize history, we don't protect our children. We rob them of the tools to think critically, to empathize, to grow." And he spoke not as an activist, not as an ideologue, but as a witness, as a custodian of memory. And then he shared a story, not from a textbook, but from his own life. His grandfather, a war survivor, whose name was erased from a local monument because his service didn't fit the narrative of heroism the town preferred. And he said, "When you say those events didn't happen, you don't just insult the archives, you insult my bloodline." And the room held its breath, because suddenly this wasn't about curriculum or policy. It was about legacy, about pain, about the invisible scars carried by families whose truths were deemed inconvenient. Greene tried to interject again, but her voice faltered, and the historian pressed on. "History is not a battleground. It's a graveyard of forgotten voices, and every time we choose comfort over truth, we bury them deeper." And his words were not loud, but they echoed, reverberated, settled into the corners of the chamber like dust that refuses to be swept away. And then he turned to Greene, not with hostility but with invitation. "You don't have to agree, but you must witness." And in that moment, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the posture of the debate itself, because the historian had done something rare. He had transformed confrontation into connection, not by conceding, but by elevating, by refusing to reduce complexity into sound bites, and as he concluded, "We're not here to win, we're here to remember," a quiet voice in the chamber whispered. That was powerful, and it was not because it silenced Green, but because it reminded everyone present that democracy is not sustained by volume, but by vision, by the courage to speak when silence is safer, by the willingness to listen when disagreement is uncomfortable. And as the hearing adjourned, the historian gathered his notes, not triumphant, not vindicated, but resolute, knowing that truth had been spoken, and whether it was accepted or rejected, it had left its mark, and that mark would ripple outward, into classrooms, into conversations, into the quiet corners of conscience where real change begins. The historian sat still, but his silence was not passive. It was the silence of someone who had learned that words, when chosen with care, could carry the weight of centuries, and as the echoes of Green's interruption faded into the corners of the chamber, he leaned forward, not to retaliate, but to reveal, and in that moment, the room felt less like a courtroom and more like a confessional, a place where truth was not argued but unearthed. He began not with facts, but with a question. What do we owe the past? And the simplicity of it struck like thunder, because it wasn't rhetorical, it was ancestral, and he continued, we inherit more than land and laws. We inherit memory, and memory is not neutral. And as he spoke, his voice carried the cadence of someone who had spent a lifetime listening to the silences between historical records, the omissions, the distortions, the deliberate erasures that shape the stories nations tell themselves. And he said, history is not a list of dates. It's a map of wounds. And Green shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable, but the historian didn't pause, didn't soften, because this was not a performance. It was a reckoning, and he quoted Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Then Hannah Arendt. The most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution. And then he added his own. The past is not behind us, it's beneath us, and if we don't dig carefully, we'll build our future on bones. And the room was silent, not because they agreed, but because they understood that something deeper was being said, something that couldn't be dismissed with talking points or partisan rebuttals. Green tried again. But what about patriotism? What about pride? And the historian nodded. Pride is not the enemy, but pride without reflection becomes arrogance, and arrogance is how democracies fall. And he told the story of a small town that removed a plaque honoring Black soldiers because it made some residents uncomfortable. And he said, uncomfortable is not the same as untrue. And the phrase lingered, like smoke that refuses to dissipate. And then he turned to the committee. We are not here to protect feelings. We are here to protect facts. And someone in the back whispered, he's right. And Green's expression hardened, but her voice softened. So you think I'm afraid of facts? And the historian replied, I think you're afraid of what facts demand. Accountability, humility, and change. And with that, the room shifted again. The energy recalibrated, and the historian leaned into the silence. I've spent my life studying the stories we bury, the massacres we rename, the heroes we forget, the laws we twist, and I've learned that the most dangerous lie is the one we tell ourselves to sleep better at night. And then he paused, not for effect, but for breath, because truth-telling is exhausting, and he said, I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here to remind us that history is not a weapon to win arguments. It's a mirror to see ourselves clearly. And he looked around the room at the aides, the journalists, the lawmakers, and he said, if you look into that mirror and see something you don't like, don't break the glass. Change the reflection. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of thoughts, of discomfort, of recognition, and Green didn't respond. not because she had nothing to say, but because she had too much to process, and the historian closed his folder, not as a gesture of finality, but as a signal that the real work begins after the hearing ends, and he said, "We are the stewards of memory, and if we fail in that duty, we don't just lose history, we lose ourselves." And with that, the mirror had spoken, and whether the room chose to listen or not, its reflection had already changed. The historian's voice softened, not because he was retreating, but because he was about to reveal something sacred, something that couldn't be debated, only felt, and as the tension in the room settled into a fragile stillness, he leaned forward and said, "Let me tell you a story." And suddenly the chamber was no longer a battleground of ideologies, but a sanctuary of memory, and he spoke of his grandfather, a man who had survived a war that textbooks barely mentioned, a man whose name was never etched into monuments, whose medals were never displayed, whose service was deemed inconvenient by the narratives that shaped national pride, and he said, "My grandfather fought not for glory, but for dignity, and when he came home, he was told to forget," and the words hung heavy, like dust in sunlight, and Green shifted, visibly unsure how to respond, because this was no longer about curriculum. It was about blood, about silence, about the quiet violence of erasure, and the historian continued. He kept a journal, filled with stories of men who never made it back, of decisions made in the dark, of truths too painful to publish, and he paused, then added, "I found that journal when I was 12, and it changed me. Not because it was heroic, but because it was honest." And the room leaned in, not physically, but emotionally, drawn into the gravity of a truth that had no agenda, no spin, no performance. And he said, "When we erase stories like his, we don't just lose facts, we lose empathy." And Green tried to interject, "But we can't teach everything." And the historian nodded, "No, we can't. But we must teach what matters, and what matters is not comfort, it's courage." And then he spoke of a school district that banned a book about civil rights because it made students feel guilty. And he said, "Guilt is not the goal, awareness is." And he looked directly at Green. "If your version of patriotism requires forgetting, then it's not patriotism, it's propaganda." And the room froze, not in outrage, but in recognition, because somewhere deep inside, everyone knew he was right, and he continued, "Memory is not a luxury. It's a responsibility, and rhetoric without memory is just noise." And he told of a ceremony where his grandfather was finally honored, decades late, in a room half empty, with a plaque that misspelled his name, and he said, "That moment taught me that justice delayed is not just justice denied, it's justice diluted." And Green's expression shifted, not to anger, but to something quieter, something resembling reflection, and the historian said, "I don't expect you to agree with me. I expect you to understand that truth is not negotiable." And he quoted James Baldwin, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And then he added, "We are facing a moment where facts are being traded for feelings, where history is being rewritten not by scholars but by slogans." And the room stirred, because the line between education and indoctrination had never felt thinner, and he said, "My grandfather didn't fight for a sanitized version of America. He fought for the right to be remembered." And Green whispered, almost involuntarily, "I didn't know." And the historian replied, "That's the point. We must choose to know." And with that, the chamber felt less like a place of power and more like a place of reckoning. And the historian closed his journal, the same one his grandfather had written in, and said, "This is not just a book. It's a mirror, and if you're afraid to look into it, ask yourself why." And the silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred, and in that silence, memory stood taller than rhetoric, and truth, for a moment, was undeniable. The historian's final words in the previous chapter didn't echo. They settled, like dust on polished wood, like truth on a conscience that had long avoided confrontation. And as the chamber sat in silence, it wasn't the kind of silence that follows victory or defeat. It was the silence that follows awakening, the kind that makes people shift in their seats not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. And in that stillness, the historian didn't move, didn't smile, didn't claim triumph, because he understood that real change doesn't come from applause. It comes from pause, and the room had paused deeply, collectively, as if the very architecture had leaned in to listen, and Green, who had interrupted with force and certainty, now sat quieter, her fingers tracing the edge of her notepad, her eyes not on the historian but on something distant, internal, and the historian, sensing the shift, didn't press further. He allowed the silence to speak, because sometimes silence is the loudest form of truth, and in that moment, aides stopped typing, journalists stopped scribbling, and lawmakers stopped posturing, because something sacred had entered the room. Not religion, not ideology, but reverence, and the historian said, softly, "We are not enemies. We are inheritors." And the phrase landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward into the minds of those present, and he continued, "We inherit not just power, but responsibility, not just stories, but scars." And Green looked up, her expression unreadable, and the historian didn't challenge her, he invited her. "You asked if I was rewriting history. I ask you, are you willing to read it?" And the question wasn't rhetorical, it was relational, and the room felt it, because it wasn't about winning anymore, it was about witnessing. And then a young lawmaker, previously silent, spoke up, "I never knew about the plaque," and the historian nodded. "Most don't, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen," and the young lawmaker added, "It should be taught," and the historian replied, "Not because it's comfortable, but because it's true." And the exchange was quiet, almost fragile, but it carried more weight than any shouting match ever could, and Green, still silent, finally said, "I didn't come here to be moved," and the historian responded, "No one does, but truth moves us anyway," and the room held its breath again, because something rare was happening. Ego was giving way to empathy, rhetoric was giving way to reflection, and the historian said, "We are all shaped by stories. Some were told, some were denied, and some we must fight to remember." And he looked around, not with judgment but with hope. This chamber is not just a place of law, it's a place of legacy. And the phrase lingered, because it reframed everything, and Green, now visibly affected, said, "I still disagree with some of your conclusions." And the historian smiled gently. "Disagreement is not the enemy, disrespect is," and the room softened not in weakness but in wisdom. And then a journalist tweeted, "This hearing is unlike anything I've seen," and the tweet went viral, not because of drama, but because of dignity, and the historian closed his notes, not as a signal of ending but as a gesture of transition, and he said, "We've held our breath long enough. It's time to exhale, together." And with that, the chamber didn't erupt. It evolved, and in that evolution, the historian had done what few could. He had turned confrontation into contemplation, and contemplation into connection, and as the hearing recessed, people didn't rush out. They lingered, as if reluctant to leave the presence of something meaningful, and Green, on her way out, paused beside the historian and said, "I'll read the journal," and he replied, "That's all I ask." And in that moment, the chamber exhaled, and history, for once, was not just remembered, it was respected. The chamber had exhaled, but the historian had not finished, because truth, once spoken, demands more than acknowledgement. It demands accountability, and as the room settled into a contemplative quiet, he leaned forward once more, not to repeat himself, but to deepen the wound, to show that beneath every historical fact lies a moral fracture, and he said, "Truth is not just a record, it's resistance." And the phrase landed like a hammer on glass, shattering the illusion that facts are passive, that they exist without consequence, and he continued, "In every era, truth has been inconvenient, and that's precisely why it matters." And Green, now listening more than reacting, furrowed her brow, as if trying to reconcile her convictions with the clarity unfolding before her, and the historian said, "When governments fear facts, they rewrite them. When institutions fear memory, they erase it. And when leaders fear accountability, they call truth divisive." And he paused, letting the weight of those words settle into the bones of the room. And then he told the story of a textbook committee that removed chapters on indigenous resistance because it complicated the narrative. And he said, "Complication is not corruption, it's completeness." And the room stirred, because everyone knew someone who had been taught a version of history that felt clean but hollow, proud but partial. And he added, "We don't protect democracy by simplifying it. We protect it by confronting its contradictions." And Green asked, "But doesn't that weaken national unity?" And the historian replied, "Unity built on denial is not unity, it's silence." And he quoted Václav Havel, "The power of the powerless lies in their refusal to live within the lie." And then he added, "Truth is not a luxury of the educated, it's the lifeline of the oppressed." And he spoke of a community whose history was never archived, whose stories were never recorded, whose pain was never validated. And he said, "They exist in the margins, not because they are unimportant, but because someone decided they were inconvenient." And Green whispered, "That's not fair." And the historian nodded, "It's not. But fairness begins with recognition." And he turned to the committee. "You cannot legislate memory, but you can legislate its erasure." And the silence that followed was not just reflective, it was haunted. And he said, "Every time we choose comfort over truth, we choose complicity." And he told of a journalist who was fired for publishing a piece on racial injustice in education, and he said, "Truth is punished when power feels threatened." And Green asked, "So what do we do?" And the historian replied, "We resist, not with violence, but with vigilance, not with outrage, but with honesty." And he looked around the room. "This chamber is not immune to distortion. It is vulnerable to it, and that vulnerability is our responsibility." And he added, "You don't have to agree with every fact, but you must protect the right for it to be spoken." And the room nodded, slowly, collectively, and the historian said, "Truth is not partisan, it's persistent." And he closed his folder again, not as a gesture of finality, but as a reminder that truth doesn't live in documents, it lives in decisions. And Green, now visibly changed, said, "I'll revisit the curriculum." And the historian replied, "Start with the stories that were never told." And in that moment, truth had not won, it had endured. And endurance, in a democracy, is the highest form of resistance. The chamber had shifted, not through force but through reflection, and as the historian sat quietly, the air around him felt different, not lighter, but clearer, as if the fog of confrontation had lifted just enough to reveal the contours of something deeper, something shared. And he looked around the room, not with triumph, but with tenderness, and said, "I didn't come here to win. I came here to witness." And the phrase landed softly, but it carried weight, because it reframed the entire hearing, not as a contest of ideologies, but as a convergence of responsibilities. And Green, still seated, still silent, seemed to absorb the words like sunlight on stone, slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. And the historian continued, "We are not here to defend our positions. We are here to examine them." And he spoke not as a scholar but as a citizen, not with citations but with sincerity. And he said, The stories I carry are not mine alone. They belong to every student who was told their history was too political, every teacher who was silenced for telling the truth, every family whose legacy was reduced to a footnote, and the room leaned in because this was no longer about policy. It was about presence, about the moral courage to stand in the discomfort of truth and not look away. And he added, I don't expect agreement, but I do expect engagement. And Green finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. I've never heard it put that way. And the historian nodded. That's because we've been trained to debate, not to dialogue. And he paused, then said, dialogue begins where certainty ends. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was open, and he turned to the committee. You have the power to shape curriculum, but curriculum is not just content. It's context, and if we teach facts without feeling, we raise minds without memory. And a lawmaker asked, so, what should we do? And the historian replied, start by listening, not to me, but to those whose voices were never invited into this room. And he told of a school that created a memory wall where students posted stories their textbooks ignored, and he said, that wall taught more in a week than some books teach in a year. And Green asked, isn't that emotional manipulation? And the historian responded, no, it's emotional literacy. And the distinction mattered, because it reframed education not as indoctrination but as illumination, and he said, we don't need to agree on every interpretation, but we must agree that every story deserves space. And he looked at Green, even yours, and she blinked, surprised. Mine? And he nodded. Yes, because your story, your fears, your convictions, they're part of the tapestry too, and if we exclude them, we repeat the very mistake we're trying to correct. And the room softened again, because inclusion was no longer a slogan, it was a strategy. And the historian said, I invite you, not to endorse my views, but to explore them, to challenge them, to expand them. And Green asked, where do I start? And he handed her a list of books, articles, oral histories, and said, start with the ones that make you uncomfortable. And she took the list, not defensively but thoughtfully, and the historian added, and when you read them, don't ask, is this true? Ask, why was this hidden? And the question lingered, because it demanded introspection, not interrogation, and he said, we are all witnesses, not just to history but to each other. And the room held its breath again, not out of tension but out of reverence. And as the hearing drew to a close, the historian stood, gathered his notes, and said, thank you for listening, not to me, but to the silence between my words. And Green stood too and said, I'll read them. And he replied, then, we've already begun. And in that moment, the invitation was accepted, and history, for once, was not just spoken, it was shared. The hearing had ended, but the moment had not. The historian's words lingered like the scent of rain after a storm, subtle yet undeniable, and as the chamber emptied, it was clear that something had shifted, not just in the room but in the rhythm of public discourse, and the echo of that exchange began to ripple outward, carried by journalists who quoted his lines, by students who replayed the live stream, by educators who paused their lesson plans to ask, what does it mean to witness? And in classrooms across the country, the historian's story became a case study, not in confrontation, but in courage, and professors wrote essays titled The Mirror and the Chamber, and political science students debated the ethics of curriculum control, and law schools dissected the hearing as a rare example of rhetorical restraint and moral clarity. And in homes, families discussed history not as a subject but as a responsibility, and Green's transformation, subtle, incomplete, but sincere, became a symbol of what's possible when ego yields to empathy. And the historian, now back in his study, received letters from strangers, from veterans who felt seen, from teachers who felt validated, from young people who felt awakened, and he read them quietly one by one, not with pride but with gratitude, because he knew that truth doesn't need applause. It needs endurance, and he said to a colleague, "I didn't change minds. I opened doors." And that phrase became a mantra for those who believe that dialogue is still possible, that democracy is not just a system but a spirit. And Green, weeks later, introduced a bill to expand historical literacy programs, citing the hearing as her turning point. And while critics debated her motives, the historian said, "Intentions evolve, impact endures," and the phrase was etched into a mural at a university library, beneath a painting of a mirror cracked but still reflecting, and the historian's journal, his grandfather's legacy, was digitized and archived, and students annotated its margins with questions, with tears, with hope, and the hearing became more than a moment. It became a movement, not loud, not viral in the traditional sense, but persistent, like a heartbeat beneath the noise. And in a podcast interview, the historian was asked, "What do you want people to remember?" And he replied, "That truth is not what we say, it's what we're willing to hear." And the host paused, then said, "That's beautiful." And the historian smiled. "It's necessary." And in that final echo, the story found its shape, not as a debate, not as a victory, but as a reminder that history is not behind us, it's within us. And when we choose to face it, to feel it, to share it, we don't just remember, we rebuild.